Now let's begin the making of commentary. This time, I'll be creating a small country called Costal, which floats on the sea in Dragon Quest VII. First, I'll outline the entire area based on the in-game map. While the exact sizes of each object aren't clear, I'm building them in practice using the size of the in-game characters as a reference. Once the outline is complete, I'll start adding details from the central passageway. After shaping it to a certain extent by extruding faces and so on, I'll use textures to represent the finer patterns like blocks and tiles. Since I want to achieve the highest possible level of accuracy, I also choose textures that closely resemble the original appearance. Next, I'll create the scaffolding found at the station. The in-game model features areas that look chipped or worn, so I'll move the vertices around to replicate these details as well. Just by doing this, it instantly gives the wood a more realistic feel, so these aspects are really helpful as references. Once the planks are done, I'll also create the supports underneath. Now that the shape is complete, I'll assign the materials. Here, I'm also using a wood textured appearance, but if I leave it as is, the entire surface will look the same. So I'm adjusting the intensity so that each wooden plank has slightly different shades. Specifically, I'm assigning a random value to each part, and the brightness changes according to that value. To make the texture easier to understand, I continue working while also setting up the world. Next, I create the pillars on both sides of the corridor. Since the shapes aren't particularly complex, I'm using basic forms like cubes and cylinders as the base. At the same time, while reusing the pillar parts, I also created the arch structure at the entrance. Next, I move on to creating the area around the building. The shapes here aren't particularly complex either, so it's mostly a matter of just building them, but I keep in mind how to work efficiently as I go. Especially for the buildings, since I might reuse them later, I'm conscious of dividing them into parts and organizing the data in a way that makes them easy to handle in such cases. Now I'll create the fences around the building. Here, I made one model of a post, then duplicated and arranged it using the array modifier. I considered using automatic array placement with geometry nodes, but since there didn't seem to be that many places where fences were needed, I decided to place them manually. For the cylindrical building nearby, I also placed fences in the same way after modeling it. With Blender 5.0's array feature, it's easy to create circular arrays like this. I also made the stairs on the rooftop, and with that, the modeling of this building is complete. Next, I created the port in the background. There are pillars here that look different from the ones before, but for these, I used models I had made in the past as substitutes. At this point, I got a bit tired of modeling, so I moved on to adjusting the materials. For the material of the pillars, I used a colored marble texture. However, it looked a bit cheap as it was, so I used an ambient occlusion node to add exaggerated wear and tear. By doing this, it gives a heavier, more realistic appearance. I continue assigning materials to the other objects as well. In some cases, only the lower part of an object is made from a different material, so a single texture alone couldn't fully capture these details. For such parts, I use nodes to recreate them. Specifically, I created a black and white mask based on height, and used that as a base to mix two different textures. The rooftop of the cylindrical building also has circular blocks, so I used nodes to represent this as well. Here, I recreated it using a feature called radial tiling, which was implemented in Blender 5.0. Now that the material settings are complete, I'll start creating the house model. For the walls, I added a solidify and a bevel modifier to a plane, making it easy to edit later on. As for the other parts, I reused models I had already made, while creating the door and windows from scratch. Since the wood materials each had quite different textures, I prepared them individually. For the walls and roof, I assigned materials used in other buildings, and with that, the house model is complete. Using the completed house model as a base, I went on to create other houses. Basically, only the shape of the roof and the position of the door are different, so I duplicated the entire model and made minor adjustments. As an exception, there were also houses with chimneys on the roof, so I made sure to faithfully recreate those parts as well. With the house models finished, next I will create the building at the entrance to the country. The shape of the passageway here is somewhat unique. It extends sideways and then shifts diagonally partway through. For this section, I used the knife tool to cut at an exact angle before extending the passage. Once the passageway was complete, I also created the boundary monument and placed it on the rooftop. Next, I'll make the torches. After creating the torch stand, the basket, and the wood to go inside the basket, I use physics simulation to drop the wood into place. By doing this, the placement looks more random and natural than if I arrange them manually, giving the torches a more authentic appearance. I'm using an add-on called Physical Dropper for the physics simulation, which allows me to do this easily without any complicated settings. Also, by adding an orange gradient overlay to the charcoal-like texture of the wood, I made it look like burning charcoal. Once you add the flame volume to that, the torch is complete. Next is the entrance. I'll start by creating the front part. For the entrance, I'm reusing the model I already made, while also creating new arch-shaped decorations for the front wall. Along with that, I also created a simple staircase model and new exterior walls. Next, I'll adjust the materials. Since the arch-shaped decorations are divided into two colors, I'll use nodes to represent this. You could also create two materials and assign them to each mesh, but personally, I don't really like that method, so I'm using nodes instead. While assigning materials to the surrounding ground and refining its shape, I start placing rocks along the outline. Since this part doesn't have any particular design features, I'm just careful to avoid any repetitive patterns when arranging them. In the same way, I also place trees and low-growing plants. Next is the adjustment of the water surface. For the water, I use a material based on density, adjusting it to achieve just the right level of translucency. This material was created by 3DCG artist Sho Fujita, and anyone can download it from the link in the description. Once you've gotten this far, it's time to create the remaining small models. First is the boat. For the boat, I use subdivision surface to create a smooth shape, and then build the finer parts based on that. I also made the log and rope used to tie up the boat. Ideally, the rope should be made from a single continuous curve, but here, for simplicity, I just stacked several circular curves together. In addition, I created and placed various objects such as two types of wooden crates, cube-shaped and elongated, as well as items like a washboard. Using a cylinder as the base, I also made a clothes-drying pole. Although it's a part that's not very visible, I also added a securing rope to give it a more detailed look. The cloth draped over the clothes-drying pole was created using cloth simulation. By adding collision detection to the clothes-drying pole and playing the animation, I was able to recreate it, but I failed several times because I didn't notice that the faces were flipped. In addition, I also made small chairs, fishing rods, and tables covered with cloth. Once these were created, I placed them in the same positions as in the game, and the model setup was complete. From here, I adjust the camera angle. Since the overall structure of the country is fairly simple, I set the camera to a slightly wide angle to create a sense of impact, and I tilt it a bit to emphasize the expanse of the sea. Also, since it bothered me that there was nothing in the distance, I added rocks and trees to create a more convincing landscape. Finally, after setting up the line art export and rendering, the work in Blender is complete. Now, let's move on to making adjustments in Photoshop. First, we'll adjust the sky. To start, I adjust the colors, focusing on the upper part of the blue sky to create a deep and vibrant sky. Next, I'll move on to painting the clouds. Using a cloud brush, I paint the cumulonimbus clouds as if placing them in the scene, then add details with an emphasis on the areas where the light hits strongly, giving the clouds a sense of three-dimensionality. Now that the sky adjustments are done, I'll move on to adjusting the base image. I'll use the camera raw filter to adjust the parts of the image other than the sky. In addition to brightening up the shadows that are too dark, I'm also correcting the overall greenish tint. Once the base adjustments are done, I overlay the line art exported from Blender. Before overlaying, I erase any unnecessary or overly dense parts of the line art. Next, I'll add atmospheric perspective effects. By using the Zeit depth image obtained from Blender to create a mask, I can adjust the image so that it becomes wider and more hazy toward the background, thereby expressing a sense of depth. Next, I use a mask that isolates only the sea area to make targeted adjustments. I adjusted the sea to have a slightly bluer tone and increased its saturation to create a more vibrant appearance. At the same time, I also added an expression of sunlight coming from the left side. At this point, I felt that the upper part of the screen lacked visual interest, so I added a bird model in Blender. Using one type of model as a base, I also created a version edited to look like it's flapping its wings, then placed these models in the scene and rendered it again. Now that I've finished adding the birds, I'll proceed with the final adjustments such as refining the light effects. I used a brush to brighten the surfaces where the light hits strongly, while also emphasizing the reflections from the sea. I also started painting a bright green color on the wall areas that touch the sea. Finally, I added a subtle lens flare from the upper right, completing the light adjustments. Lastly, to add a sense of dynamism to the image, I finished by adding blurred radial lines, mainly around the edges. How did you find this making of commentary? I'll be uploading more behind the scenes videos like this in the future, so if you're interested, please subscribe to the channel and stay tuned. Well then, see you in the next video.